There are 15 participants on the call, including you. You are joining your conference as a participant. For a menu of available commands, press *#. Your connection is now in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. Thank you for joining us. Today's webinar is titled A Closer Look at Safe Routes to School Programs in Rural California, a Guide for Communities and Partners. I'm Justine Hearn with the Active Transportation Resource Center at the California Department of Public Health. Our work is carried out through an interagency agreement with the Caltrans Active Transportation Program. And our role here as part of the Active Transportation Resource Center is to implement a statewide project to assist local communities with creating, implementing, and evaluating active transportation non-infrastructure programs, including Safe Routes to School programs, by providing targeted trainings, technical assistance, and resources. We also support the Active Transportation Program non-infrastructure and Safe Routes to School awardees and potential applicants by providing Safe Routes to School and bike and pedestrian safety education, resources, and health-related program expertise. Some quick housekeeping announcements before we get started with our presentation. As shown on the slide, please use your phone for the audio for this webinar, and we will mute your phones for you. We've done that already. If you're having difficulties with WebEx, please click on the contact support link in the calendar invitation for this webinar. Today's webinar will be recorded, and the recording will be posted on our website following the webinar. Questions and comments are encouraged. Please submit your questions through the dialog or chat box on your screen. You can type in your question at any time, and we'll have speakers respond to the questions near the end of the webinar today. Again, welcome to our webinar, A Closer Look at Safe Routes to School Programs in Rural California, a Guide for Communities and Partners. The webinar features the resource guide shown here, which you can find on our website at the link that's shown on the slide. You'll also be able to access this presentation with contact information on our website, casaferoutestoschool.org. By the end of the webinar this afternoon, participants will gain a better understanding of the prioritization tool in the Safe Routes to School Programs and Rural California Guide, and learn from a local example in Merced about approaches to implementing Safe Routes to School rural programs. And we'll feature the following speakers, including myself, again, Justine with the California Department of Public Health, Jenny Weiss, Senior Planner at the Natural Resources Services Division of the Redwood Community Action Agency in Humboldt. Jenny and her colleagues have had many years of experience developing Safe Routes to School programs in Humboldt County and coordinate both the Greater Eureka and Humboldt County Safe Routes to School task forces. They have also provided consulting expertise on projects, including Mendocino County Safe Routes to School Plan. And last, we'll hear from Stephanie Nathan, Program Manager with the Prevention, Policy, and Planning Unit at the Merced County Department of Public Health. Stephanie has led multiple Safe Routes to School projects in Merced County, including education efforts around policy and systems change that led to the adoption of school policies that now directly support Safe Routes to School at those schools. Thanks again, Jenny and Stephanie, for your time this afternoon. And I'll first get us started with a brief introduction to the Safe Routes to School Programs in Rural California Guide. So this document was created to address the unique needs of rural communities in developing Safe Routes programs and to share examples of Safe Routes to School work taking place across the state in rural areas. It was written by the Redwood Community Action Agency staff in Humboldt County, as well as the Safe Routes to School's Technical Assistance Resource Center staff before we made the transition to become ATRC, the Active Transportation Resource Center here at the Department of Health. Short vignettes from rural communities are embedded throughout the document, Called out as county highlights, they feature Safe Routes to School programs that illustrate different challenges and strategies in rural communities. The guide begins with an overview and introduction to rural California and the common barriers to active transportation there, with examples of how some of those communities have addressed challenges. The guide then outlines 3 different strategies for facilitating Safe Routes to School and active transportation programs. The first strategy examined is forming a Safe Routes to School task force as one way to explore community needs while offering an organized process for education and action. The second strategy discussed is incentivizing school and parent participation to improve community engagement and to motivate staff and parents to participate in programs. And finally, developing a remote drop-off location for rural students as a way to increase opportunities for safe walking and biking for students who live too far from schools to walk or bike directly from home. The guide concludes with 2 tools, the Rural Walkability Audit and a Prioritization tool. And we'll now move on to hear from Jenny with the Redwood Community Action Agency on more about the Prioritization tool and their experience there in developing a remote drop-off program in Humboldt. Thanks, Jenny.
Well, thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, loud and
Great.
clear.
Again, I'm Jenny Weiss, and I'm a senior planner at the Natural Resources Services Division of Redwood Community Action Agency. And we're a nonprofit organization in Eureka, California, which is on the North Coast. We're 5 hours north of San Francisco and about 2 hours south of the Oregon border in Humboldt County. And our agency works with disadvantaged communities. We help them become self-sufficient, and in particular, our division, Natural Resources Services, works to promote healthy communities and watersheds. So we manage active living and trails projects, and we've been coordinating Safe Routes to School projects for about 10 years or more. And we did, like Justine said, we worked with the then Safe Routes to School Technical Assistance Resource Center, now Active Transportation Resource Center, to help develop this Safe Routes to School Programs in Rural California toolkit. And it was created to help other rural regions develop and sustain Safe Routes programs. So I'm really excited to be here today and share with you some elements developed for the toolkit. So if you could go to the next slide. Specifically, today I want to share information about the school prioritization tool because it's been one of the most useful things for us here in Humboldt County. Just to go back with a little history, it's something that we helped develop along with our regional transportation planning agency, the Humboldt County Association of Governments, or HCOG. It's comprised of 3 main components. There's a metrics tool, there's a Safe Routes to School inventory, and there's also a spatial tool. And so I'm going to be talking about some of the successes resulted from using the tool, as well as the formation of a local remote drop-off program. So next slide. So even though it may not seem like it, walking and bicycling certainly represent a significant means of transportation in rural areas. In fact, work trips made by bikes in small towns is almost double than that of urban areas, according to recent data from the U.S. Department of Transportation. And I know many of you on the webinar are already aware of the challenges that rural communities face. They're very unique challenges from urban and more suburban areas. So understanding these challenges really helps put into perspective the importance of including rural communities in programs that improve safe walking and biking, and that's especially true for kids. So first off, you know, people living in rural areas have fewer options for getting physical activity. We just don't have the same level of pedestrian and bicycle facilities as more populated areas, and it makes walking and biking dangerous, and especially when you think about the topography, winding, narrow roads, and just, you know, dangerous places that dissuade parents from allowing their kids to walk or bike to school. Also, thinking about in rural areas, often those that are in unincorporated communities have fewer resources and funding to implement transportation projects. So that can be a real barrier. And because of that, it's really important to apply unique strategies to each school. Every school has to have a different program because they have different challenges and different concerns and different opportunities. So programs really need to be tailored to specific communities or schools. For example, we had a school in Maple Creek, California, where there's a running club, and Somesbar, excuse me, I was going to talk about the community of Somesbar, where the Salmon River meets the Klamath River, and that's out in Siskiyou County, which is about as rural and remote as you can get. And there's a school, Junction Elementary, that has a running club, and that's a K-8 school. And they can't, there's no infrastructure, and so the schools have to put up a sign that says, you know, kids running from 1:30 to 2:30 on this very scary road. I can't even imagine. So, you know, rural areas just have to have fewer resources and funds and have to take unique measures. Another common problem in rural areas is that we have a lot of students being bused to school. Buses picking them up from home, but not only from home, some kids have to get picked up at a bus stop that's on a very highly traveled street or on state highways with very little walking infrastructure. And at the same time, I know it's really been an issue here in Humboldt County over the years that budgets for bus transportation have really dwindled. Obviously, rural families tend to live further from schools, so without that bus service, parents are forced to drive kids to school, in some cases an hour or more in each direction, and sometimes students just don't go to school when there's no bus transportation. Language and cultural barriers can also affect rural communities. More than half of the state's rural students are minorities, and more than 1 in 4 is an English learner. And so, you know, sometimes we really rely on parents and caregivers to volunteer for these Safe Routes programs, and it's not always easy to engage and reach non-English speaking families. So that can really be a barrier too that needs to be addressed. And then lastly, you're probably also familiar with what we call a rural attitude, and that just means a culture of driving in small towns. But it also refers to communities where residents want to preserve rural qualities. We don't want to put in sidewalks and things that are more urban that don't fit into our community. So regardless of these challenges, rural communities are still, in many ways, leading the charge when it comes to safe routes to school. So next slide, please. So in 2012, my agency was contracted by our local RTP, Regional Transportation Planning Agency, HCOG, to help develop a rural Safe Routes to School prioritization tool. And we were assisted by the private firm Alta Planning and Design. And the tool was designed to help jurisdictions identify schools with the greatest need and capacity for Safe Routes to School programs. So rather than local entities competing for the available pots of funding, HCOG concluded that Humboldt County applications would be more competitive if everyone just decided collaboratively which schools should be prioritized. So the tool takes into consideration need based on several different factors: school location, existing infrastructure, socioeconomic status of students and families, and safety concerns like posted speed limits, collision history, especially pedestrian and bicycle-involved collisions. Other elements of the project included distributing and collecting Safe Routes to School parent surveys. We also selected 2 pilot schools to conduct walkability assessments. We developed walking maps and also maps with suggestions for infrastructure improvements that have since been submitted with several Safe Routes to School and Active Transportation Program grant applications. Next slide. So So let's talk about the elements of the tool. We're on slide 12, is that right?
Yes.
Oh, not, okay, and alrighty. So we have three key elements basically used to prioritize schools. We used school readiness and internal need and external need. So just overall, schools were given a score for different criteria under each of these elements, and the resulting points were tallied to determine how the school ranked overall in the county. And because the purpose was to decide which schools had the greatest need for safe routes to school, the tool really relied on school readiness. And that was based on information that we gathered from just about 100 phone calls made to all the schools in the county to basically assess their knowledge, interest, and participation in safe routes to school. So the inventory calls determined whether or not there was support from an administration, whether or not the school has been engaged in safe routes already, whether or not they have a active PTA or PTO or a safe routes to school champion. You know, as you probably already know, it's really hard to carry out these programs when schools aren't engaged or don't have the time or the interest. So the task force that also formed as a part of this project, we formed a countywide task force to help guide this project. They decided that there needed to be a lot of weight to go into school readiness. So there's a maximum score possible of 35 points. It might be hard for you to see all of the elements on the slides. I'm going to be kind of breaking down what all the elements are. So, so the tool also looked at internal need, and that included the percentage of students eligible to receive free or reduced lunch, how students scored in national aerobic fitness testing to include health status in the ranking, and also school enrollment numbers to determine the reach of potential programs. So the maximum number of points possible for internal need is 18 points. So next slide. Okay. So we made the phone calls, and we wanted to, you know, find out who was the appropriate person to talk to. So when we called, we would ask to speak with the principal or the transportation manager or whoever was the appropriate person who would have that knowledge of the school transportation and safety concerns and needs. And we had a whole list of questions. We asked things like, you know, are you familiar with safe routes to school? Have you engaged in safe routes programs? Are there current safety concerns around students walking or biking to school? We asked if there were concerns around children's health or kids getting enough physical activity. We asked if they had engaged PTA, PTO, if they have crossing guards. So basically, we worked with the task force to come up with these questions, and then we called every school in the county and compiled all of that information into summaries so that we could assess the results. Next slide. That's not the next slide. That's not, okay. So the other piece of criteria we needed to gather was internal need, and it was pretty simple because everything we were looking for is available publicly online. And so the internal need was based on the percentage of kids eligible for their free and reduced meals, and we found that through school accountability report cards, the SARCs. It's also based on fitnessgram data, or how students fared when being tested on various physical fitness standards that are conducted every year with 5th, 7th, and 9th graders. The public health status of schools was really seen as an important factor for prioritizing investments as a matter of health equity. So that had a pretty strong weight. We also looked up enrollment numbers to determine how many kids would be affected by these non-motorized transportation safety improvements. So again, we were easily able to access all of this information through online sources, mainly the ed-data.org website that lists fiscal, demographic, and performance data on all of California's K-12 schools. Next slide. So another key aspect of assessing schools' need for Safe Routes project is external need. And what that refers to is the on-the-ground reality of the situation for walking and biking to and from each school. So essentially, the factors that affect student safety or mode of travel to school. We assessed this need by collecting information on the presence or absence of existing bike and pedestrian facilities like crosswalks, sidewalks, bike lanes, etc. We also considered posted speed limits, collision data near the school. The number of carless households from the most recent census data was also considered. So, you know, the task force, the countywide task force, emphasized that equity was really a key element here and reason that the schools that lack walking and biking infrastructure or have experienced more pedestrian and bicycle collisions should be prioritized higher for improvements. And in addition, the communities surrounding schools with a higher proportion of carless households are more likely to be dependent on non-motorized forms of travel. So they have fewer options to get to school. So so that weight was also weighted pretty high. So the total points available for the external need criteria is 25, because also determined by the task force to be very important. Next slide. Some of the external need items were determined through a spatial data component. So the project team determined there was existing data sources like the Census American Community Survey, and TIMS and SWITR's collision data that would make getting detailed data for each school more efficient than, you know, assessing the school's landscape in person. So the project team and the task force researched potential spatial data that relates to the school's need for safe routes. And what they chose was pedestrian facilities, whether there are or not pedestrian facilities, posted speed limits, existing bike and trail facilities, percentage of carless households, and bike and pedestrian collision frequency. Those are the indicators. Some of these things could be assessed through the school inventory calls. You know, for example, some of the schools knew, you know, they could tell us if they had sidewalks, crosswalks, or other pedestrian facilities adjacent to the school. But we had to rely on spatial data from county shapefiles, master plan, census data, and also the U.S. Berkeley Safe Trek site, TIMS, the Transportation Injury Mapping System, and SWITR's data. And that type of data comes in a GIS, Geographic Information System format, and it's used to more efficiently and accurately assess the external factors that may influence each school's need for safe routes projects. So when it's available, GIS is a way more cost-effective and accurate way to compile the data at a range of spatial scales. You know, in the case of a countywide assessment like we did in Humboldt, prioritization using only field verification would be really expensive in terms of time and financial cost. So the GIS component was designed to assess the school's external need for safe routes to school based on this variety of roadway characteristic and demographic indicators. Excuse me. The project team surveyed the available spatial data from public sources and individual jurisdictions that could help assess external school need. And we gave a total of 5 points max for each category, totaling 25 points in the external need section. So you can see the points for each section are tallied at the end to determine each school's ranking. Next slide. So each school receives a certain number of points for each line of criteria, and the points are tallied at the end. I think there should be a slide up for that shows each line of criteria. Maybe that was the last one. Well, here you can see the external need criteria. There we go. Thanks. Now you can move the slide forward. And one more, please. Thank you. Okay, so like I said, rather than each jurisdiction competing for the same pot of money, Safe Routes to School applications are more competitive if jurisdictions decide together which schools should be prioritized for funding. This tool can really help rural schools learn about Safe Routes to School also. During the inventory calls for the tool, a lot of the schools that we talked to had never heard of or didn't find Safe Routes to Schools to be relevant to them, but at least now they know there are people working on these safety issues, and we were able to assist several small school districts connect with public works departments and make improvements. For example, we called a rural school to gather some data, and they didn't really find the Safe Routes discussion relevant because their students live, several miles away, and there really aren't any sidewalks or anything. But a couple weeks later, we got a call back asking how they could get school speed zone signs on their road. So we were able to notify the public works department, who wasn't aware of those missing signs, so they were able to get their signs within a week. So that was a really great example of how the tool really helped spread Safe Routes awareness in our area. So here in Humboldt County, the prioritization tool is hosted on the website of HCOG, our RTPA, and that page is listed on the slide. And the page also, this project was an impetus for creating the website, which now has a lot of local information, including all our parent survey reports, walk audit reports, walking maps, a lot of good information on that site. Next slide. So the tool really had the unintended benefit of helping us get Safe Routes to School out into the community. And so I just want to say to those of you in rural communities that haven't yet done so, developing planning tools is a very valuable and good use of time for future projects and funding opportunities. Here in Humboldt County, we've had a lot of success using the tool for grant applications. Next slide. So I'll share with you some of the successes that I feel really were a direct result of using this tool. We received a Safe Routes to School Cycle 10 grant from state funding, and that let's see. So Cycle 1 ATP funding for the non-infrastructure program at Eureka City Schools. So the Redwood Mobility Education Program. Let's talk about that one. So that is a program now that was through the Cycle 1 program, and it's for multiple schools in Eureka. One of the schools that will benefit from the Redwood Mobility Education Program ranked #1 on our prioritization tool, and another one ranked #2, so that's a really great example. We also got ATP funding for a remote drop-off program at Lafayette Elementary School in Eureka, and another non-infrastructure program for Toddy Thomas Middle School in Fortuna. So all three of these were a direct result of using that tool. These schools ranked high, and then they were able to receive that funding. And this is out of 90 schools countywide. Also wanted to mention that the school that ranked #1 got a separate grant. This was through Safe Routes to School Cycle 10, and that's Grant Elementary, and they received an infrastructure grant. And so, it was just very rewarding to see these high-ranking schools receive this funding. Next slide. So another important Safe Routes endeavor we've been working on here in Humboldt County, which is also highlighted in the Rural Safe Routes to School Guide, is remote drop-off programs. And so we're just starting to work at Lafayette Elementary in Eureka through that Cycle 1 ATP grant I mentioned to support a remote drop-off program. The remote drop-off is going to create a location for parents to drop off and pick up students on a regular basis so that kids who live too far to walk all the way to school will have the chance to receive at least some physical activity on the way to school. And the program will also have the benefit of decreasing congestion around the school, which will likely improve safety for other students that are already walking. So we received funding through that ATP Cycle 1. We started a monthly Walk to School Day event where kids get dropped off and walk the rest of the way to school with adult chaperones. You know, every first Wednesday we do our Walking Wednesdays, and that's with adult supervision. And we have a large participation rate each month. We've got probably a quarter to a third of the student population participating. We have the school mascot come, and he's the Lafayette Lion, and the kids get really excited. We always review safe walking tips every time before we walk, and the adult volunteers help us remind students about how to be safe while they're walking. And the kids absolutely love it. So our goal is to educate students about how to be safe pedestrians while we help parents feel comfortable allowing their kids to walk by installing infrastructure between the remote drop-off site and the school. So the grant is going to put in sidewalks and crosswalks and kind of shorten the crossing distance at several intersections, hoping that, that this could be a regular location for parents to drop off and pick up their students. Next slide. So through this adventure, we had a lot of different successes with, I mentioned some of them, but with this last cycle of the ATP, Cycle 2, we used the tool, and we also received funding for 6 additional schools and communities that, for a total of, about $6.5 million came into Humboldt County. One of the schools, South Fortuna, ranked number 3 on the tool. One of the schools ranked number 5. Some of them ranked higher, which is interesting. One of the schools ranked 30 and one ranked 43. But, you know, the reason why some of those lower ranking schools ranked so low is because at the time that we did this, which was, you know, it's been a few years now, but 3 or 4 years, there wasn't as much community or school support for Safe Routes programs. And so in that, that inventory, you know, they didn't rank as high. But there's so much more interest now that if we were to redo this tool, I know that most schools would rank a lot higher. So, you know, a lot of schools are completing the parent surveys, and there are more principals and superintendents showing interest. So, you know, we're just really thrilled that this has really helped us move forward with creating safe opportunities for kids to walk and bike here in Humboldt County. Next slide. So with that, I would like to thank you very much for letting me speak about this tool and share kind of the process. And I look forward to answering any questions or hearing any comments that anyone has. Thank you very much.
Jenny, thank you so much for sharing about the prioritization tool and about the, your experience in using the tool in your projects up there, helping it to get, some of them to get funded, as well about the remote drop-off program. Thanks again for your time.
You're welcome.
All right. With that, we will move on to hearing from Stephanie Nathan with the Merced County Department of Public Health. And Stephanie, just a reminder to, if you haven't already, do *6 to unmute yourself.
Thank you for the reminder, Justine. Hi, everyone. Again, my name is Stephanie Nathan, and I'm a Public Health Program Manager with the Merced County Department of Public Health within the Prevention Policy and Planning Unit, which houses a lot of our policy systems and environmental change grants, including our SNAP-Ed program, our Partnerships to Improve Community Health program, our Lifetime of Wellness, so the CDC 1422 grant, and previously it housed our California for Health grant, which I'll talk a little bit about today. So next slide. And you can go through this. This is just a disclosure. So I want to start with talking a little bit about Merced County because I know that many people don't know much about the Central Valley of California, but it is a rural county. We are considered a medium-sized county. So we have just over 250,000 people county-wide, but we do have, you know, a population center in the city of Merced, but we have many unincorporated communities, approximately 18. And the focus of my presentation today is going to be talking about the community of Winton, which is an unincorporated community in the northeastern part of the county. So there's some characteristics of Merced County that make us distinct. Is we're mainly an agricultural county. The majority of the population is Hispanic and Spanish speaking. So approximately 57% of our residents are Hispanic. You'll see that that's even more so in some of our more rural areas. And the other distinction of Merced County, unfortunately, is that we have high unemployment rates and extremely high poverty, particularly in children, and very high rates of overweight and obesity in both adults and in young children. Next slide, please. So the focus of the presentation today is going to be in about the community of Winton. So Winton, as I said earlier, is a small, unincorporated community in the northeastern part of Merced County. So this is a community that faces many of the same issues that many unincorporated communities and rural communities face throughout California. So just lack of resources, and a demographic population that has some challenges in terms of being harder to reach in terms of the county, having difficulty reaching out to the population. So the population is approximately 10,613, so just a little bit under 11,000, so we're speaking about a small community. It's about 70% Hispanic. Many of the worker families have parents that work in the fields. Many of the students there are might be English as a second language. The challenges that we see in the community of Winton are lack of infrastructure or poor infrastructure. So there's either no sidewalks or very limited sidewalks, or the ones that are there are not very well maintained. The same with the roads. The roads aren't well maintained. There's also an issue, a big issue actually, with loose dogs. There's high crime rates in the community of Winton compared to the rest of Merced County, and Merced already has a higher than normal, a higher than average crime rate, and then high rates of obesity. So in the community of Winton, when we looked at the California Physical Fitness Test and we looked at fifth graders specifically in the elementary schools there, about 61% were considered in the categories of needing improvement or at high risk when we look at for obesity. So these are some of the challenges that we see. One kind of highlight of the community of Winton that is kind of that we do a lot of efforts around and center a lot of our community engagement around is the school district. So Winton School District is an integral part of the community of Winton. It has 3 elementary schools and 1 middle school, so it doesn't have a high school. And because the community is so small, I'll talk a little bit later about how the majority of the students that attend are able or have the possibility to walk and bike. Next slide, please. So this is kind of an overall picture of what I'm going to talk about today in terms of the Winton story and kind of the elements that go into this story. So we received funding from California for Help. I'll talk about that a little bit later. And this story involves working with different community partners, stakeholder engagement, as well as resident engagement, and as well as the collection of data and using some technical experts. And I'll talk about each of these components in more detail in the next slides. So next slide, please. So how did it start? So, you know, Merced County received funding. In 2012, Merced County was one of 12 counties that was a subcontractor of the Public Health Institute's Community Transformation Grant. And so that consortium of 12 counties was called CA for Health. So that's how Merced County first started doing Safe Routes to Schools. Prior to this, we had no Safe Routes to School experience, and so we were learning really everything from scratch. So one of the focus areas of CA for Health was Safe Routes to School. And one of the requirements of that grant was that we have a diverse leadership team. And so when we started early on, we started to think strategically about how do we want to form our leadership team. So we reached out to partners that we thought would assist us, and one of those partners was school districts. And at the beginning, because we didn't have any connections and didn't have any experience with Safe Routes to School, we literally did like a mass email to superintendents and principals trying to find out, is anyone interested in working with us? With some short bullet points about Safe Routes to School. We got very lucky in that we had a superintendent, Mr. Heller from Winton School District, reply and say, oh, I'm willing to meet with you and learn more. So we met with Mr. Heller back in 2012, and that started our partnership that we still have to this day. We talked to him about, the importance of walking and bicycling, about what we see in the community of Winton, and about our goals to increase active transportation among students, and how we related that to the obesity epidemic that we're seeing, and presented some data and some localized data as well. It also helped that we had relationships with partners in that community. So we did have relationships with some community-based organizations like Cultiva La Salud and Lifeline Community Development Center, which were in that community. So that's how we got the superintendent on board, and he was very excited about this work. And one of the first steps that we decided to do was to do surveys, some parent surveys. So next slide, please, and I'll talk about the parent surveys. So we decided to do some data collection to kind of get a baseline of what's going on in the community of Winton. Why aren't people walking and bicycling? I should say during that first meeting, one of the things we noticed was there was 2 bikes in the bike rack at the school. So we knew that people weren't bicycling there. And in our conversations with Mr. Heller, and as he started to participate on the leadership team of our grant, he was talking about how, traditionally, he just doesn't see people ride their bikes, and he sees a few parents walk their kids to school, but, overall he felt like there could be more of an emphasis on it. And he really felt like this was a great thing for this particular community because the community was so small, and even though it was rural, the close-knitness of the community in terms of how close the homes were to the school made it a really good community to initiate this effort. So we started collecting Safe Routes to School surveys, and we distributed them in the packets for their initial packets that went out with the parents that they have to sign, at the very beginning of the school year. And so we collected 846 surveys from the 3 elementary schools, and this was done again at the beginning of the school in 2013. And what we found was that more than 70% of the students within the elementary schools lived within 1 mile of school. So that was a very positive thing for us. So we knew that there was a possibility of us really changing the way that people go to and from school. But we found only a quarter of the students walked to and from school, and less than 1% of students rode their bike. And with this survey, we also looked at, specifically we were interested in why weren't people walking or bicycling. And we got a variety of answers for that. Violence and crime actually kind of came to the top, which of course was alarming for us at the Public Health Department because we didn't have those immediate connections at that time to address that issue. But right behind violence and crime was safety of intersections and crossings, speed of traffic, and amount of traffic along routes, as well as sidewalks or pathways. And so looking at kind of those top 5 issues, we knew a lot of those we could address in terms of education, in terms of speed along the routes, and working with our partners like the Public Works Department and Planning, who we also had on our leadership team. Next slide, please. So we started to try to tackle those issues that were identified one by one. One of the ways that we did that was by partnering with community-based organizations to have encouragement and education activities. And again, this was going back to the idea that one of the issues that was of concern was, for example, amount of traffic along the route and speed. And one of the things we saw when we went out and did observational assessments in the mornings and in the afternoons was that people were speeding along the route right in front of the school. So we did some educational billboards, and we also did some educational presentations. So you'll see on the bottom left, that was one of the billboards that we put in front of the schools, and they were in English and in Spanish. We did education on the bottom right to parents and to students. We actually partnered with the local Bicycle Coalition, which was, it's not actually even a nonprofit, it's just a group of people who are bicycle enthusiasts. But they were basically experts on riding bicycles. And so they did presentations to the students in the classroom and to parents at like back to school assemblies. And a lot of the focus was on slowing down when they were driving and also on bicycle safety. We also did bike rodeos, helmet fittings, and we started to do bike and walk assessments, which I'll talk about next. So next slide, please. So the walk and bike assessments were a great success. We did 2 walk-bike assessments in September in 2013. Again, going back to our data collection findings, which showed that safety of intersections and crossings were a big issue, and sidewalk and pathways. These were in the top 5 in terms of issues that were that rose to the top in the surveys. So we utilized the local government commission to help us do the walk-bike assessments, and we gathered a group of diverse stakeholders. So we have residents you'll see in the pictures. In the bottom left, that's our Director of Public Works. We had the Planning Department, we had an elected official, one of our Board of Supervisors member, the Superintendent, and then just community residents and some community-based organizations that we partner with. So the assessments were focused near schools, so near the elementary schools, and we also had a bike assessment component, which isn't pictured here, but at the same time that we did the walk assessments, our Bicycle Coalition, with a couple of community members, rode bicycles around the area as well so that the view from the bicycles could be included. So the assessment started with a presentation from the local government commission about the importance of community design, the importance of how that impacts walking and bicycling, and then a group walked the community. I should say that the focus of the group was from the parents of the school, since it was about safe routes to school. So what we did was we had the walk-bike assessments immediately following like the school drop-off time. So school, I can't remember when school started, but if it started at 8, we had the walk-bike assessments at like 8:30 in the morning, so that when parents dropped off their kids, it happened right then. And we had the room that we're pictured in is actually at the school, so the school gave us a room to do it. So it was really focused on the school. So a group walked the community, another group biked the community, and then the group came back together and wrote on large aerial maps. They wrote suggestions and feedback and recommendations about what they'd like to see in their community. It was very focused on the school in terms of what they'd like to see around the school, since that's the area we walked, but they did give us larger suggestions as well as just things they'd like to see overall to improve walking and bicycling even away from the school. Next slide, please. So this is just an example of one of the assessment maps, and what those are, those kind of text boxes, are ideas that the community wrote down. So this data was compiled into a report that summarized the community engagement process and findings from those 2 walk and bike assessments. The report also included recommendations. And one of the recommendations in the report was that we seek funding to make the needed infrastructure changes, because we know that many times, especially in public health, we're in the community, we're talking to them about the importance of walking and bicycling, bicycle safety, safe walking, talking to drivers about slowing down, but the community is also really interested in these infrastructure changes, which would make it easier for them to do that safely. Next slide, please. So there were a couple of really positive results that came through this process. One of the more immediate results was a district-wide safe routes to school policy. So throughout the process of engaging the residents, of engaging the parents, the students, the planning department, the superintendent, we felt that there was a need to develop a comprehensive safe routes to school policy. And we did do this early on. It was one of our kind of goals. We were focused on education, but we always knew that we wanted to implement a policy so that this would be longer term beyond the life of the CA for Health grant. So we were fortunate enough to bring a policy to the board, and the board was supportive because they had seen the activities that we were doing, and they had heard positive things from the parents, and we had started to see an increase in terms of the number of students walking and bicycling. So the comprehensive district-wide safe routes to school policy includes required bicycle and required safe routes to school education in the class for 4th and 5th graders. It requires traffic safety training and education for staff. It supports the creation of walking school buses and bicycle trains, encourages and promotes events such as walk and bike to school day, and it also included a no idling policy for buses and cars. And since the adoption of the policy, we, of course, are still doing work, which I'll talk about in a little bit, in the community of Winton, and we've seen that they have really done a good job of upholding and sticking to the policy, so we're really proud of the school district. Another result was that we were able to collaborate with Public Works on the first cycle of the ATP grants. So one of the recommendations, if you remember, that I said that came out of the bike walk audits was applying for funding to do some of the infrastructure changes that are needed, that the community pointed out. And so Public Works applied for an infrastructure grant along the road in front of the Civil Crookham Elementary School, which was one of the schools that the bike and walk audits focused around. And we collaborated with Public Works for the non-infrastructure portion of the grant. And we were awarded a grant. So we actually haven't started work. We hope to do that soon. But the infrastructure portion will focus on curb, gutter, sidewalks, and bike lanes in front of Civil Crookham Elementary School. So it's going to be focused on one school, and I do know that they are also going to apply for there's 3 elementary schools in the district. They are also going to be applying in the future for ATP funding for some of the other schools. But we decided to start with Civil Crookham since we had the most comments around that school district. And then in terms of the non-infrastructure portion of the grant, we are collaborating with Public Works to do education on proper use and do the encouragement of and do more encouragement activities. In addition, our ATP project is going to focus on addressing the chief concern that came out in the surveys, which was safety and crime and violence. That was something we didn't get to address through the CA for Health grant just due to a lack of time. But what we're going to focus on with the ATP funds is organizing, putting more effort and infrastructure around the organization of walking school buses and bicycle trains. And we do feel like that's a way that we can address the crime and violence issue by working with the Sheriff's Department to help us implement those walking school buses and bicycle trains. One of the things that we have found is that people walking in groups, they feel more safe, of course, but it also deters crime from happening. When a criminal sees a group of people walking versus just one person walking alone, they're less likely to commit those crimes. So that is going to be one of the mechanisms we use to address the concerns that came out in that survey. Another component of what we're going to do is kind of along the lines of safety is some of the kind of open-ended comments that we got in Merced County, and I know this is similar in other rural communities, was the issue of stray dogs. So again, we're going to be working to put in place, as people form these walking school buses and bicycle trains, to identify areas where they see those dogs. This will be one of the kind of roles and responsibilities of the walking captain or the bicycle captain, and they'll be giving that information to animal control. So we're just trying to find creative ways to address some of these issues that came up from the surveys. Next slide, please. So some of our ongoing efforts and next steps. So we've been fortunate to receive funding from the CDC for the Partnerships to Improve Community Health grant. So along the same vein as Safe Routes to School, we're doing a lot of effort still in the community of Winton that builds upon what we started with that CA for Health funding. So we're continuing the Safe Routes to School efforts, one through the ATP funding when we start that project, and also through our SNAP Ed grant, which is going to be focused also on Safe Routes to School and promoting active transportation. Winton is one of our kind of target CX3 communities, so we'll be continuing to work that way. Some of the complementary work that we're doing through the Partnerships to Improve Community Health funding efforts is open use policies for the school district, so people are able to walk there and also able to use the facilities now. We have Zumba classes going and opening up the outdoor space. We're also working with the planning department and again the local government commission on the Winton community plan and the Winton Park plan. So we're continuing efforts to increase physical activity through these collaborations with non-traditional partners. And then lastly, we're hoping to implement the ATP grant that I talked in detail about this summer. So next slide. So overall, some of the lessons that we've taken from our experiences in Winton are the need to work collaboratively with local partners. So much of the success we've had has been because of our local partners. So of course the superintendent was critical in the school district and just the willingness and eagerness of the community to participate, but also the local community-based organizations. In our case it was Cultiva La Salud, which really helped us kind of bridge the gap between the county and the Spanish-speaking population there. They were critical in that. We had another group, Lifeline CDC, which really was in touch with the community and helping us organize the bike and walk audits and get the surveys out. Utilizing experts. So, you know, we did not have the ability to really do bike assessments, for example, but utilizing the Merced Bicycle Coalition to lead those efforts and utilizing local government commission to lead the walk bike audits. The collection of data was critical as well because that assisted us, one, in knowing the needs of the community so that we are focusing and targeting our implementation efforts where they should be targeted, but also because it helped us later when we needed to seek funding for those infrastructure changes. Also, we found that small amounts of money do go a long way. We were able to give small, very small portions of funding through subcontracts to organizations such as the Bicycle Coalition to support some of the bike presentations, the bike education, and the bike walk, the bike audits, and that was a very effective use of money. Collaborate, I've already talked about that, and then have fun. You know, we had so much fun doing these Safe Routes to School projects, and the community really enjoyed all of the things that we did, and I felt like it was a beneficial effort. And I also feel like because we had so much fun doing it, the board members saw that, and it was easier for us to approach the board and ask them to support something like a district-wide Safe Routes to School policy because they saw that it was beneficial to the community as well as to the school. Next slide. And that's it, and here's my contact information, and feel free to reach out at any time. Thank you.
Stephanie, thank you so much for that presentation and sharing your experience with getting started with this work and CA for Health. I know we worked together on that work there, and there's so much going on there, and it's fantastic to see it continue with the other opportunities that have opened up for you, including the active transportation program. So speaking of which, we will have time for questions. We have a few already coming in that we're going to get to in a few minutes, but I wanted to take a moment to share about the current cycle of funding available through the active transportation program, Cycle 3. It's underway right now, and this slide provides some highlights of the current cycle, which will be programmed for the years 2019 to 2020. And 2020 to 2021, those fiscal years. There's about $240 million available for the program, and we definitely encourage you to visit the California Transportation Commission's website for the final ATP guidance. including the scoring rubrics, which were just released. And please also visit Caltrans' website to access the application itself, along with the application instructions. A little bit more about Cycle 3. The call for projects was released on April 15th, and applications are due on June 15th. Applications are to be delivered both electronically and hard copies by mail, and the electronic portion of the application is new this time around, so there's a little bit, give yourself plenty of time if you haven't started already to work through that electronic version online. Projects that are not selected under the statewide small urban and rural solicitation process are distributed to the MPOs based on their location for an MPO selection process. So check with your local MPO for additional requirements and deadline information. The California Transportation Commission will adopt the MPO project on January 27th of 2017, and the statewide and small urban and rural project adoptions will take place December 7th and 8th of this year. Another reminder, again, to please check the CPC and Caltrans websites for their latest information posted there. And we did want to point out that the projects designated as rural or small urban based in those communities have been successful so far in ATP and even appeared to have competed better in the last cycle, Cycle 2, than they did in Cycle 1. So we're now ready to take questions from the audience. And we have a few already, but just a reminder that you can use the chat function on your screen for WebEx to submit questions for any of the speakers today, and we'll get to them verbally here. So we had a question come in for Jenny. How did the RCAA go about selecting the pickup and drop-off locations for your remote drop-off program? Just a reminder, Jenny, in case you haven't already.
Can you hear me?
Yes, now we can hear you.
Okay, sorry.
No problem.
How did we select our drop-off location? So, we initially selected a location that we felt was a safe location, for the landing. Basically, we wanted a place where there was room for people and kids to gather, as well as a safe place separated from the kids where cars could park and drop off. So we initially selected a church parking lot. And it's the current location that we're walking from is about it's about a mile to the school, and this is where we're walking from now. But I don't think it's going to be where we're walking from when we select our final location for the regular remote drop-off. We're looking at different locations now for that, and it looks like we're going to select a site that's closer to the school because we are, in talking with the principal and the county that we're working with on this project and the risk manager and the transportation manager, we want it to be a successful program. So we are looking at a spot that's closer to the school because we feel that more parents are likely to use it, to feel comfortable letting their kids walk without that adult supervision once the infrastructure is put in place. So basically, the task force kind of talked about it as a group, and that included the district transportation manager, the county's risk manager, and the principal.
Great, thank you. We have a question here for Stephanie. What type of staffing do you have at Merced Public Health to carry out your Safe Routes to School related activities?
Yes, we have a health education specialist that will be doing a lot of the Safe Routes to School work once we start the ATP non-infrastructure component, and they'll be doing it probably half-time. So we don't have a lot of staffing dedicated to this work. Now through PICH, we do have staff that are working on broader a full-time health education specialist dedicated to the physical activity components, but that includes safe routes to school as well as joint use efforts.
Great, thank you. And another question for you, Stephanie. Did you provide safety, or are you planning to provide safety lessons to the students around the violence and crime issues that you mentioned? Does that include stranger danger issues as well?
That's a great question. We have not done that. We do want to do that. One of the things I need to check in on with just the ATP funding is what we can do around safety. I had my initial question around, I posed this question initially around what we can do around crime, but it seems like they don't want us to venture too far off into working with crime. So we have been limited in terms of the funding that we have and our ability to work on crime issues, because a lot of times funders, even the CDC, has difficulty seeing the link, even though there is a clear link, seeing the link between, you know, crime and how that might impact someone's desire or impact the parents allowing their children to walk and bike. So we haven't done a lot of haven't had a lot of focus on that, but I do like that idea, and it's something that we could definitely consider.
Great, thanks for taking that. That's definitely a tough one. Another question for me, actually, are all the tools that I referenced in my part of the presentation available in the rural resource? Yes, actually, the resource guide itself, if you go to our webpage, you can print the whole guide out, and embedded within the document or like scattered throughout the document are the resources that are relevant to each of the sections. So as you're going through, it might mention right in the text of the document some resources, other documents or guides, and you can click on the links if you're looking online, or it'll, there's also call-out boxes that tell you where those resources can be found. And then on the website itself, where the guide is hosted on our website, there's a resources section, so you can just look at the resources, including other case studies and guidance tools and best practices if you just want to skip straight to looking at resources. So unless any more questions trickle in here, that's the end of our questions for this afternoon. So I'll move on, unless anything else pops up, to letting you all know to please look out for a Survey Gizmo email that will show up in your inbox today if you've registered and attended today's webinar. And it will also include questions regarding your interest in additional assistance in your safe routes to school and active transportation work and Cycle 3 applications. So if you are having some additional questions after today's presentation, or you're working on your application, or already working on a safe routes or active transportation project, please, you can always contact us, but you can also indicate an interest in help with those questions in the survey that you'll be receiving shortly. And again, if you have any more questions, you can, if it's about the guide itself, you can always take a look at the guide on our website, which is listed here, or you can contact me directly. There's my email address. And you can also contact any of us here at the Department of Public Health. We encourage you to ask us questions, again, about your projects, or if you're just getting started, or about the information presented today, and we'd be happy to put you in touch with our speakers or other resources that might make sense for you, depending on where you are with your project. And as you can see here with this map, each of us on staff are assigned to different regions of the state to target technical assistance and consultation on safe routes and other non-infrastructure components of active transportation projects. We're broken up by Caltrans districts, since we're working with Caltrans to provide these services. And we serve as a point of contact for existing awardees, award seekers, nonprofits, community and parent champions, schools, public works departments, and other parties interested in working on safe routes and active transportation in their communities. We're excited to be able to lend a public health expertise and perspective to facilitate safe routes and non-infrastructure projects and evaluation all over the state, so please don't hesitate to contact us. And with that, that is the conclusion of our presentation today. Thank you again so much, Jenny and Stephanie, for your time and the work you put into preparing this information to share with everyone today. It's really valuable, and we're grateful for your expertise and, again, your time and sharing, because we know that rural projects around the state are looking for a little bit more guidance in getting their Safe Routes project started. Thank you so much, and please contact us if you have any questions. Have a good afternoon.